It also seems unlikely because most of the 5.5 million Palestinians living between the Jordan and the Mediterranean would put up fierce resistance if Israel tried to expel them from their homes. Nevertheless, there is reason to worry that Israelis might adopt this solution as the demographic balance shifts against them and they fear for the survival of the Jewish state. Given the right circumstances, say a war involving Israel that is accompanied by serious Palestinian unrest, Israeli leaders might conclude that they can expel massive numbers of Palestinians from Greater Israel and depend on the lobby to protect them from international criticism and especially from sanctions. We should not underestimate Israel's willingness to employ such a horrific strategy if the opportunity presents itself. It is apparent from public opinion surveys and everyday discourse that many Israelis hold racist views of Palestinians, and the Gaza massacre makes clear that they have few qualms about killing Palestinian civilians. It is difficult to disagree with Jimmy Carter's comment earlier this year that the citizens of Palestine are treated more like animals than human beings. A century of conflict and 4 decades of occupation will do that to a people. Furthermore, a substantial number of Israeli Jews, some 40% or more, believe that the Arab citizens of Israel should be encouraged to leave by the government. Indeed, former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni has said that if there is a two-state solution, she expected Israel's Palestinian citizens to leave and settle in the new Palestinian state. And then there is the recent military order issued by the IDF that is aimed at, quote-unquote, preventing infiltration into the West Bank. In fact, it enables Israel to deport tens of thousands of Palestinians from the West Bank if it chooses to do so. And of course, the Israelis engaged in a massive cleansing of the Palestinians in 1948 and again in 1967. Still, I do not believe that Israel will resort to this horrible course of action. The most likely outcome, in the absence of a two-state solution, is that Greater Israel will become a full-fledged apartheid state. As anyone who has spent time in the occupied territory knows, it is already an incipient apartheid state, with separate laws, separate roads, and separate housing developments for Israelis and Palestinians, who are essentially confined to impoverished enclaves that they can leave and enter only with great difficulty. Israelis and their American supporters invariably bristle at the comparison with white rule in South Africa. But that is their future if they create a Greater Israel while denying full political rights to an Arab population that will soon outnumber the Jewish population in the entirety of the land. Indeed, 2 former Israeli prime ministers have made this very point. Ehud Olmert, who was Netanyahu's predecessor, said in late November 2007 that if the two-state solution collapses, Israel will face a South African-style struggle. He went so far as to argue that as soon as that happens, the state of Israel is finished. Former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who is now Israel's defense minister, said in early February of this year, as long as in this territory west of the Jordan River there is only one political entity called Israel, it is going to be either non-Jewish or non-democratic. If this bloc of millions of Palestinians cannot vote, that will be an apartheid state. Other Israelis, as well as Jimmy Carter and Bishop Desmond Tutu, have warned that if Israel does not pull out of the occupied territories, it will become an apartheid state like white-ruled South Africa. But if I am right, the occupation is not going to end, and there will not be a two-state solution. This means Israel will complete its transformation into a full-blown apartheid state over the next decade. In the long run, however, Israel will not be able to maintain itself as an apartheid state. Like racist South Africa, it will eventually evolve into a democratic binational state whose politics will be dominated by the more numerous Palestinians. Of course, this means that Israel faces a bleak future as a Jewish state. Let me explain why. For starters, the discrimination and repression that is the essence of apartheid will be increasingly visible to people all around the world. Israel and its supporters have been able to do a good job of keeping the mainstream media in the United States from telling the truth about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians in the occupied territories. But the internet is a game changer. It not only makes it easy for the opponents of apartheid to get the real story out to the world, but it also allows Americans to learn the story that the New York Times and the Washington Post have been hiding from them. Over time, this situation may even force these two media institutions to cover the story more accurately themselves. The growing visibility of this issue is not just a function of the internet. It's also due to the fact that the plight of the Palestinians matters greatly to people all across the Arab and Islamic world, and they constantly raise the issue with Westerners. It also matters very much to the influential human rights community, which is naturally going to be critical of Israel's harsh treatment of the Palestinians. It is not surprising that hardline Israelis and their American supporters are now waging a vicious smear campaign against those human rights organizations that criticize Israel. The main problem that Israel's defenders face, however, is that it is impossible to defend apartheid because it is antithetical to core American values. How does one make a moral case for apartheid, especially in the United States, where democracy is venerated and segregation and racism are routinely condemned? It's hard to imagine the United States having a special relationship with an apartheid state. Indeed, it is hard to imagine the United States having much sympathy for one. It's much easier to imagine the United States strongly opposing that racist state's political system and working hard to change it. Of course, many other countries around the globe would follow suit. This is surely why former Prime Minister Olmert said that going down the apartheid road would be suicidal for Israel. Apartheid is not only morally reprehensible, it also guarantees that Israel will remain a strategic liability for the United States. The recent comments of President Obama, Vice President Biden, and General David Petraeus make clear that Israel's colonization of the occupied territories is doing serious damage to America's interests in the Middle East and surrounding areas. As Biden told Prime Minister Netanyahu in March, quote, "This is starting to get dangerous for us. What you're doing here undermines the security of our troops who are fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. That endangers us, and it endangers regional peace." This situation will only get worse as Israel becomes a full-fledged apartheid state. And as that becomes clear to more and more Americans, there is likely to be a serious erosion of support for the Jewish state on strategic grounds alone. Hardline Israelis and their American supporters are